J. Warner Wallace is a cold case homicide detective who's been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Dateline, and Court TV. Now, we join him as he applies his investigative skills to making a case for Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at Cold Case Christianity. I'm J. Warner Wallace. Today we're going to talk about developments on the university campus, efforts to actually advance the cause of atheism that in the end up demonstrating the truth of theism. And I'm talking about a chair for atheism that was established on the campus of the University of Miami. And like other campuses that might try to do something like this, the efforts to actually advance the cause of atheism, especially when they're done in this way, actually demonstrate that just the opposite of atheism is true, because you have to stand on the truth of theism in order to ground the movement that you're calling atheism. We'll talk about why that's the case. This is all based on an article I wrote a couple of years ago. It's at our website at Cold Case Christianity, and the article is simply called Why the University of Miami's Chair for Atheism Confirms the Existence of God. And this is a kind of a longer version of an article, and sometimes when you write articles for other websites, they end up getting edited there, so you can find the longer version on our website, but this actually also appeared at the Christian Post in their Voices section under the same exact name. Okay, so what actually happened? Well, several years ago, a chair for atheism was established at the University of Miami. It was actually reported in the Atlantic, and here is the article talking about what it was that was reported. How should atheism be taught is the name of the article at the Atlantic. Now, what's being described here is that the University of Miami established a chair for atheism on the basis of a donation that was made by a wealthy donor. And the chair is called, I'll read it to you, it's the Louis J. Appignani. I think it's probably Appignani, A-P-P-I-G-N-A-N-I, Appignani or Appignani. It's a foundation. It is the chair. And basically the article describes the fact that the University of Miami established this chair, the Appignani Foundation Chair, for the study of atheism, humanism, and this is important, secular ethics. Okay? Now, this was funded by somebody who had the ability to afford to fund this. So sometimes people will say, well, why are our tax dollars being spent on this or that? And this can be argued in both directions, so I'm not here to argue that. But in this particular case, this was on the basis of a private donor who provided the money for this. And the article actually at the Atlantic describes this, so we can see it's actually from Louis J. Appignani, who funded the position with a $2.2 million endowment. That's not that much altogether, I would say, for this kind of thing, hoping to, quote, legitimize the word atheism in the public sphere by creating a foundation whose founding principle, quote, founding principle asserts that the planet will only survive if non-acceptance promoted by faith-based ideology, that's how it's described, non-acceptance promoted by faith-based ideology is replaced by rational scientific reasoning. Now let's think about that. He's actually trying to stop something that he sees as evil or immoral, this non-accepting kind of view that he thinks that theists hold. Now, when asked about this, he actually gave a much longer interview at an article, another article that describes this at the time, New York Times. Kind of a combination of both these articles we'll use to see what it is that the donor believes was immoral about faith-based groups or theistically based groups. Here's what he said in the New York Times article. The New York Times article, by the way, is posted here. It is called University of Miami establishes chair for the study of atheists, just basically describing what we just talked about. But in this article at the New York Times, Appignani says this about his efforts and why he wanted to fund this position to begin with. And he says that he wanted to fund it because I'm trying to eliminate discrimination against atheists. So this is a step in that direction. So clearly what he's saying here is that he sees an evil that he wants to be corrected. He wants the evil of discrimination against atheists, sees that as an immoral act. And so he's willing to spend $2.2 million of his own money, give him credit for that, in order to address what he sees is a moral failing in our culture Now you might say to yourself, well, gosh, how can that be? It seems like as theists these days, we are largely under attack by those who are atheists. And especially if you kind of hang out on Twitter or YouTube, you'll see that this is very much the case. I'm often asked, why don't I engage more with atheists on Twitter or YouTube? And I'll be honest with you, it's a very different platform because it's so anonymous. And so for the most part, the people who are commenting on those platforms do not really identify themselves truthfully. Usually they're under a moniker. And there seems to be such vitriol on both sides. Don't get me wrong. It brings out the worst in all of us. Very different to engage on Facebook, where you've got your family photos and your last birthday party and your kids' birthday party and sporting events are on the same page, where you're probably not going to be a hammer looking for a nail on that platform as much as you might be on YouTube or on Twitter. And that definitely seems to be the case in the comment sections of videos, and it definitely seems to be the case in the interactions on Twitter, where most people are not there as a social network. They're really there to argue and complain and rail about what's happening in current events. So if you kind of hang out on those two platforms, you might say to yourself, well, it doesn't seem like atheists are, they seem to be pretty outspoken and pretty comfortable in their skin on those two platforms. But I think that what Apignani does identify properly is that while that might be the case on those two public platforms, for the most part, there's a silent majority of Christians in the country who are kind of sitting back and watching this and saying that's kind of like another world out there that we're not engaged with, that we still vote based on our values, we still think and select media consumption based on our values, we still interact with others based on our values, and I think a lot of atheists see this as discriminatory. In fact, I know that Apignani does because he said this in the article on The Atlantic. Here's what he said. He said that atheists are one of the few minority groups in the country to still be widely ostracized by society. While, and I'm probably thinking, is that really true? But bear with me. While other marginalized populations such as women and LGBT people are active in American politics, that's still not the case for atheists. Now, that's interesting because he's kind of focused when he says that they're widely ostracized. It does appear that he's talking more about politics than anything else. Now, I think that this last election cycle with Bernie Sanders running as an openly unbelieving atheist, that probably things are shifting. And I do think in the next 10 years, you will see that whatever he's talking about in terms of being ostracized, you will see that shrink, if not vanish. So I think, but still, you would say, whatever the majority group is in a culture, don't be surprised if that majority group seeks people who are like-minded, because this is that problem I've called Otherism, and lots of other videos I've done on YouTube and lots of other videos I've done at the NRBtv network. We talk about how we are innately drawn toward people who are like us. This is true for everyone, regardless of worldview. We see others as otherly if they don't agree with our values. If they're not like us, we see them as otherly, and we typically don't hang out with people who are otherly. This is just true for every single group, regardless of ethnicity or worldview. And so if you've got a group in the country that still occupies over 60% of the populace, then don't be surprised if you're in part of that other 40% if you feel like you're in some way ostracized. I get it. And that'll be the case for whoever ends up, as the thing shifts, that'll be the case for us if we are in that 40% as believers. So just be ready for that. This is the nature of it. And so he sees this now, and he decided to spend $2.2 million of his own money to form a chair, a department at the University of Miami, a department that will promote atheism. Now, interestingly, in his effort to do that, to promote something that he thinks is true on the basis of a moral failing that he sees in the culture at large, he ends up basically affirming the thing he's denying. He's affirming theism, even though he is forming a chair, a department for, and by the way, that chair, let me read to you who ended up taking that chair. It wasn't that long afterwards. It was filled by somebody who was really, it was filled by a former professor, quote, professor of metaphysics and the philosophy of science at the University of Notre Dame. So it's already been filled, this thing, in this chair. It's a couple of years, 3 years ago, and it's been operating ever since. Now, people who are smart, who have degrees in philosophy, I sometimes still wonder how they don't see the fact that philosophically, this effort exposes the weak underbelly of the effort to begin with. It demonstrates that atheism can't be true if, in fact, you're taking this view, and I'll tell you why right after the break.
Be sure to download the free Cold-Case Christianity app from the iTunes Store and the Android Marketplace. The Cold-Case Christianity app puts all the resources from coldcasechristianity.com in the palm of your hand. You can read the daily blog, listen to podcasts, and watch videos from within the application, and Jim uses the app to send direct messages to fans of Cold Case Christianity. The app will also link you to all Cold Case Christianity social media and provide you with a direct connection to J. Warner Wallace. Download the app today and become a better Christian casemaker.
Jay Warner and Susie Wallace have written 3 kids' books to help children know the truth and defend it in the public square. All 3 books mirror Jay Warner's adult books, chapter by chapter. And best yet, the kids' books are written as fictional stories that will turn your kids into detectives as they solve mysteries and learn about Christianity. There's also an interactive academy website at casemakersacademy.com where your kids can join other cadets and complete their own academy notebook. Each course has free videos, activity sheets, and more. Your young readers can even earn their own junior detective graduation certificates and appear on the Honor Cadet Wall. Be sure to visit casemakersacademy.com to learn more.
Okay, now what's interesting about this effort to form a chair for atheism is not so much that just on its face, you could do this. You could form a chair for atheism because you think that the evidence for atheism is superior to the evidence for theism. Or you might just say, I just don't think, you could also easily argue that I don't think it's my burden as an atheist. I just think, evidentially, I just think that there's not enough evidence as a theist. So I could hold this position because many people would say, we could disagree with them, but many people would say that this is the default position. Atheism is the default position. If you're going to argue for this invisible God, the invisible spaghetti monster, well then that burden is on you to demonstrate the spaghetti monster exists. Now I've argued that that's not actually true because we simply are trying to explain the crime scene. We're simply trying to explain the world in which we live. And both of us, anyone who has got an explanation for the world, has to be able to offer the reason why they think that explanation is the most sound. And what we're saying is that certain forces would have to be in place for the universe to be the way it is. We would argue as theists that one of those forces, the force of all forces, would be God as a creator, as a source of certain features of the universe. If someone's going to suggest that atheism is true, well, then you have to have a different set of causes to explain the origin of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, the origin of life in the universe, the appearance of design and biology of that life that's in the universe, consciousness, mind, free agency, and even this thing we're going to talk about next, which happens to expose why the University of Miami's chair for atheism actually demonstrates the existence of God, and that is the existence of objective, transcendent, moral truths. Because here's what the argument is. As Appignani wants to start this particular chair and fund it with $2.2 million, he's arguing it needs to be so because there's an evil that needs to be corrected. It's immoral, the way that atheists have been treated in culture. That's what he's arguing, that it's not right. He's arguing for a moral truth, as though that moral truth is more than just a matter of his personal opinion or the opinion of those few people who would actually openly declare themselves to be atheists. And that's a small minority of people who are willing to say that I am absolutely an atheist. I'm not even agnostic. I'm just an atheist. That is true. That number is probably between 7 and 8 or 9% in the culture, maybe even lower, who would say that that's where I land. Most people are either religious or spiritual in some way or agnostic in some way, but to say that I've already decided there is no God, I'm an atheist, you will be in the minority in our country, a dramatic minority. But you're arguing here that there's an objective, transcendent, immoral behavior taking place in the way that they're being discriminated against. That it's not a matter, well, where do morals come from? How could this be so that we ought to care, all of us ought to care enough about this to change the way we see atheists? That's the effort here. Why should we do so if morals, if this is only immoral because you don't like it, well, you could eliminate this, just change the way you feel about it. It could be moral again, right? Or are you saying that no, the way we're mistreating some people in this country is objectively, transcendently immoral, regardless of any people's group's opinion of it? Because let's face it, you're only going to get moral truths from one of two places, subjectively or objectively. What I mean is, they could just simply be, moral truths could simply be the result of personal opinions. If that's the case, then everyone's got a different personal opinion, and unless you're willing to say that some people qualify less as persons than others, you're going to have a hard time arguing that if I come up with a moral ethic, why would you want to reject it? You think you're more of a person than me? All of us have equal status as persons, therefore our views of morality, if they are only grounded in persons, ought to be considered as equally moral, unless you're saying I'm less of a person than you. We don't think that that's the case anyway. Nobody thinks that's the case, right? Because you're not going to say, well, whatever Charlie Manson thought was okay to do, he should be allowed to do it because, hey, he's a person and all moral truths are grounded in persons, therefore this has got to be okay to do. No, most people would say, well, no, they're grounded in groups, societies, cultures that decide what is right and what is wrong. Well, remember, even if you said that, all societies are, cultures are just groups of subjects. This is still grounded subjectively. In other words, you just have more than one subject. You have a group of subjects who agree. And if you were really saying that that's the case, and I've written about this on our website at coldcasechristianity.com, are objective moral truths merely a matter of cultural agreement? So you can see that article. You'll see why I argue that can't be the case. It's the same problem arises if you argue that they're coming from groups of persons, as the argument fails the same way as it would if you were arguing from a single person. Because if you have two groups, Germany in World War II and everybody else, you wouldn't be able to argue that what Germany was doing was immoral, because they could argue, no, it's grounded in what we as a group decided to do. Whatever China decides to do, you'd have to argue that's fine because China as a group has decided to do it. And then you could argue, well, whatever any large group decides to do then would be the moral position, because all moral truths come from groups. Well, really? Well, then how do we affect moral change in the 50s and 60s? How do you even pass laws? How does a Martin Luther King Jr. persuade a country in which the majority disagreed with him? If moral truths come from majorities, from groups, then the person in the minority philosophical position is by definition immoral. Look, if these aren't grounded transcendently in something bigger than subjects, then everything is just a matter of either single opinions or group opinions. And you know that if your group is smaller than the other group, they can argue, well, we outnumber you. And historically, lots of groups have held terrible moral views, but they outnumber and outpowered their opposition. We would still argue that what you're doing is wrong because your opinions never made it right to begin with. It turns out these things you were doing were either right or wrong objectively because they're grounded in something that's bigger than your group and bigger than my group. This is what Martin Luther King Jr. did. He argued that we need to look to what is to a moral ethic which transcends all groups. It's bigger than you and it's bigger than us. But how do you ground that? If it's objectively immoral to treat atheists in any particular way, you'd have to ground this in an objective source for morality, which turns out to be the problem if you're an atheist, right? Because all you have, humanism, requires the opinions of humans who decide what is moral. And that's all you can really go to. There isn't anything that transcends humans. And there's the problem with the entire endeavor. Now, it is true, I think, that they would say, right, that they're being treated in a way that is not right, or is not treated as though they are the majority, because they aren't the majority. And for the most part, you'll see that even polls that have been done in the last few years, here's a poll, for example, from the Pew Center, right? And this poll from the Pew Center discusses 10 facts about atheism. And here's one of the biggest takeaways from this article. You'll see that really more than half of us would be less likely to support an atheist for president. That's still true. And so I think this is what Apignani sees. He sees that this view of atheists still is negative, especially when it comes to politics. And so, but by the way, it's not just that's the case for theists who feel this way about atheists. Make no mistake about it. There's actually something even more interesting going on here, because there are other polls, more recent polls, that have been taken. For example, this one, which is from, it's called The Cut. It is an article in The Cut. Everyone's suspicious of atheists, even other atheists. That's right. They've done lots of surveys on this. Not only will more than half of us be less likely to support an atheist for president, but atheists are also suspicious. Statistically, you'll see that even atheists would prefer a theistic. Why is that? I think because they recognize that there's probably an ethic, a code, that theists are more likely to be consistent with as a group than atheists. And that's kind of what the polling suggests, even from atheists when they view other atheists. So it's not just as though, hey, the whole problem is with how you Christians think about us. It turns out that the problem is also how you think about each other. And so you got to kind of just at least be realistic about that. Now, so the question becomes, can I somehow get a transcendent, objective value of moral system from just humans? Now, one effort that I thought was probably the most clever is when Sam Harris says, well, you could, because the transcendent thing that transcends every people group is not God. It is instead the human biology, which is common to every people group. And so if humans just focus on flourishing biologically, they will end up arriving at a transcendent moral ethic. Now, I've written about this on an article on our website also called Is Right or Wrong Simply a Matter of Human Flourishing? And there's a problem with that, right? In the end, you have to define what the word flourish means. If the first aspect of flourishing is survival, and that's the problem with most moral ethics, is that one group wants to survive, and it always ends up being some form of survival of the fittest. And you'll see this as the first step in flourishing. You cannot flourish if you don't exist. And so the idea would be, I would sacrifice my own people group in a regional battle, say for food supply. I would sacrifice my own, because I think there's some aspect of human flourishing that I'm interested in. I'm interested in my tribe surviving over your tribe. I'll probably destroy your tribe to get that food, and I'll probably eat your tribe after I'm done. That's just the nature of how we battle with each other. And so this idea of human flourishing, I just don't see how, practically speaking, it has ever been successful. We are not, that assumes that we are at our core good people from birth. I see no evidence of this. You don't have to teach your kids to stop hitting their brother, or to stop stealing the toys from that neighbor's kids, or to stop being selfish and all completely This is our natural inclination. It's not that we're corrupted over time. We start off this way. And that's why I think this idea that somehow if you just removed these exterior forces, we would be the wonderful people we are always inclined to be from birth, I think that's not true. I think we see that if you've ever raised kids, you know it's not true. Okay, so how do we ground this? Now, I will see some people will argue that you can't ground it in God, though, because if you try to ground this in God, are these things that God recognizes, and therefore he says this is what's good and what's bad? Because if that's the case, if he recognizes something that pre-exists him, a notion about good or bad, you don't need God to interpret that. Just go to the pre-existing notion of right and wrong. Or is it a matter of God saying, well, no, I'm deciding what is right and wrong? Well, that's the case. Can he just change his mind whenever he wants? And every decision about morality is based on the willy-nilly nature, the changing nature perhaps of God. We would argue that God doesn't change. But aside from that, is that where they're coming from? Well, actually, we don't hold either one of those positions as Christians. And I've written about this online as well. And it's in an article called God Didn't Create Moral Law. It's simply a reflection of his character. Our argument as theists has always been that God is simply in a universe, and because he's the creator of our universe, and he permeates our universe like salt in the water. When you put salt in water, you get salty water. Because God has created this environment, and he permeates the environment. It reflects his nature, and his nature is such that these moral truths are true, and evil is what it is because it reflects God's holy standard. When you deviate from the holy standard, you get evil. This is why this is such a strong argument for the existence of God, that if there are moral truths that are more than simply a matter of opinion, then you have to ground them in something that's not subjective, and you move immediately away from a humanistic view of ethics towards something that involves theism. This is what C.S. Lewis knew was true, and this is why he said it this way. Of course, this is from Mere Christianity, a great book, and he says, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. Like a lot of people who don't believe in God would say this, but how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of what a straight line is. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? Yeah, exactly. So, of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too, for the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my private fancies. And there's the problem. For anyone establishing a chair for atheism in any university on the basis of how atheists have been mistreated. If you think that atheists have been mistreated, have been treated immorally, unjustly, well, is that just a matter of your own private fancy, or do you think that they are really being treated unjustly? Because if they're really being treated unjustly, you're back to where C.S. Lewis was all those years ago. That you've now demonstrated that that straight line that you now think is crooked in the culture requires the straight line. It requires God's holy, just notion of what is righteous. And without a standard of righteousness, a straight line, you don't really understand what a crooked line looks like. And that's why the chair for atheism at the University of Miami actually proves that God exists. Hope this was helpful to you, and I'll see you right here next week at Cold Case Christianity.
To hear more from J. Warner Wallace, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For more information on this week's topic, visit youtube.com/coldcasechristianity with J. Warner Wallace. Thank you for joining us on this Cold Case Christianity broadcast.